And thanks to Bintani, welcome to an evening with Professor Charlie Bamforth. My name's Pete Michum. I work for Radio Brews News, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here to Newstead Brewing Company. And thank you very much to both Bintani and Newstead for hosting our event live at 5 with Professor Charlie Bamforth. Even though, now for those folks out in Facebook land, it's okay for you guys, you haven't had the gag spoiled. But for those in the room, just pretend, all right? So when I do the big thing, pretend it's the first time you heard it and Matt didn't fuck up the punchline, all right? So. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last week I have had the pleasure and the honour of being able to introduce our guest on 6 different occasions. Fortunately to 6 different audiences, so I was able to use exactly the same intro each time and get the same laugh. So I'm going to give it another run this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, our very special guest tonight, would you please welcome the Professor of Beer, the Pope of Foam, the Sultan of Suds, the Duke of Diacetyl, the Ayatollah of Autolysis, Professor Charlie Bamforth.
6 different introductions. I think of 6 different talks, though. You know.
Well, speaking to your good wife, Diane, I do understand that we've barely scratched the surface of the material that you have available. And is there any truth to the rumour that when you finally do retire from being the Professor of Beer at UC Davis, that there's still an option of perhaps doing a stand-up comedy tour?
Do you know, I've been roasted 3 times, I think, in Sacramento at the Comedy Club. And the local radio station got it and said, "We understand you're doing stand-up comedy." I said, "No, I'm being roasted." But they said to me, we do the comedy, you be the straight man, but I don't do the straight man.
I can't see you being a straight man at all. Charlie, you've been back in Australia this time for about 2 weeks,
Yep.
And it's been a couple of years since your last visit. You've had a bit more of an opportunity, I guess, this time to travel and, dare I say, drink more widely. Your thoughts on the Australian beer scene, where we're at the moment compared to your last visit?
I'm excited. I mean, there's a lot of energy, and it's the same as the craft business, so-called craft business, in so many parts of the world. And you know, in Adelaide at the conference down there, there's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of people thirsty for information, a lot of great places to drink beer. Then I was over to Perth. A long-standing friend of mine, Ken Arrowsmith, so we were there at the brewery, Northbridge Brewery, and again, great beers, great scene, great food, fantastic food, and then down to Melbourne and so everywhere we've been here in Brisbane, you know, this passion for beer, and it's great, it's fascinating. You know, first time I ever came to Australia actually was to Brisbane, and that was in 1988, and that was for the Institute. It was called then the Institute of Brewing. It was the then called Australia New Zealand section, and it was their convention. It coincided with the Expo here. So I was saying in Adelaide, but nobody, I don't think, realised what I said. It was that, you know, my favourite was the Cook Island stand. The dancers they were gorgeous, and I'll never forget that. And my wife is going to forgive me for saying that. But then it was a totally different world. Then there was a war going on between a couple of guys called Elliot and Bond, and there was this real anger between the 2 sides in those days, and you weren't allowed to buy the beer of the opposite company and so on. And somebody in one company, I remember, somebody had left his company, and this guy got in the lift, the elevator with him, and the boss man turned his back and looked at the back wall of the lift and ignored him for the rest of the journey, whatever number of floors it was. It was just sordid, you know. So I don't see that these days. I see a lot of energy, a lot of vibrancy, and passion for the product, and that's a damn good thing.
Fresh is best. Discuss. With relation to, and we should point out, to put a little bit of context around that, but part of the reason that I guess you got in touch with us to put on tonight's show was a podcast that you were involved in the States, and you were talking about best before dates.
Yeah, and this was down at the Brewing Network, and And I was talking about freshness, and it was total plug for my latest book.
Thank you for that. Oh, no, I thought it was a plug for us.
No, well, you plug for you, but a plug for a book which is actually called Freshness. This is a series of 6 books. Each one's dedicated to a grandchild. I've done 3 so far. We've got 4 grandchildren, so we've got work to do. And I was talking about, to my mind, beer, the best beer, with possible exception of some more alcoholic beers, is the youngest beer. And I personally, I've always said things like, drink beer locally, drink it close to the brewery, all of those good things. And I personally believe that beer goes downhill from the time it's brewed, unless it's a beer that will mature in the same way as a wine would mature. Otherwise, it's downhill. You get stale, you get Tomcat pea flavor, and so on. And I guess you can celebrate that. And you can say, yeah, it's just absolutely fantastic. I just love the Tomcat urine on this product. But so I personally feel it should be fresh. And with beer, it's a real challenge. Most beers, they start to age pretty damn quickly. And to me, it detracts from the drinkability of the product. I think a fresh beer is easier to consume than a stale beer. Drinking old beer will not kill you. And you can build a storyline around it. And I think I said this in Adelaide. I know somebody from a large brewing company, not in Australia, who actually said, we should make the beer as stale as possible before it leaves the brewery, on condition it's never going to get any worse than that. And that is a marketing strategy as well. So it is about marketing, and if the market will stand older beer, and might even be celebrated, then I understand. It's just that my personal belief is that the fresher the beer, the more drinkable it is. There's a famous brand of beer in the United States with an eagle floating across it. And of course they have what is called a born-on date, where it lists the date at which the beer is packaged, and it says alongside, for freshest taste, consumed within 110 days. And that is assuming that a beer will be stored at this sort of temperature, 20 degrees Celsius, and in about 3 months it's okay, and after that not so much. And I personally think there's a lot of sense by that, as long as a company lives up to it. So I think keeping beer fresh. This is quite a long answer, isn't it?
No.
Just shut me up if you don't. But beer, I think, is fresh. The challenge is it's difficult to achieve it. This beer here in front of me, it's delicious beer, probably contains about 1,000 different types of molecule that contribute to the flavor. And if one of them changes, goes down or goes up in level, and you detect a change, that's flavor instability. The beer has changed, and it's different to what you expect it to taste like as the brewer. It takes me back to when I worked for a large company in the UK called Bass, and we had lots of different breweries making a beer called Carling Black Label. And in the brewery where I was a QA manager, our Carling Black Label tasted of grainy. It was really grainy. And the headquarters said, you've got to get rid of that. And so we got rid of it. The head brewer, Neil Talbot, and myself, we managed to get rid of it. And the headquarters said, brilliant, take a pay rise, it's great. And that's when the beer started coming back from the customers to the brewery. What the hell have you done to the beer? You've screwed up the beer. And they were used to it. So if people are used to stale beer, give them stale beer every time. Consistently stale. So you have a policy, you've got to have a policy. Whatever it is, whether it's fresh or whether it's stale, make sure it's the same thing every time. But 1,000 different compounds. So how do you, and some of these you can detect them at very low concentrations. So how do you stop it from changing? And there's only 2 real solutions. One is keep out the oxygen from the finished beer. And the second one is keep the beer as cold as you can without freezing it. And that'll slow everything down. So a very good friend of mine, Ken Grossman, Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, he ships his beer refrigerated everywhere in the world. Costs a lot of money, but he believes in freshness. To believe in freshness means you've got to dig deep in your pocket. And, you've got to make that decision. Do you believe in it? Do you want it to happen? Or if you don't, then, that's okay. It's okay another way.
But Charlie, and Ken's beer is available here. He sends it fresh, and then we have a huge continent, and the beer has got to be sent around the continent. And we don't seem to have a logistic chain that's set up to handle those sorts of beers.
Yeah, and that is a problem. I'm surprised that Ken would accept that. And I'm not sure he would be comfortable with it. I remember he was on vacation in Hawaii once, and he encountered I'm not sure when he was on vacation what he was doing in a warehouse, but and I'm sure Katie, his wife, wouldn't be very pleased with it. But nonetheless, he found the warehouse wasn't refrigerated, and he was not a happy camper. So it is about logistics and shipping beer around. People say, in the world of freshness, this obsession in the world of brewing with keeping the air, keeping the oxygen out of the brew, and of course, like brewers want to do, they want to blame the maltster. So they say, the maltster should be looking after this. And at the end of the day, you've got to work back. It's what you do at the end that really matters. This born on date. I was in a restaurant once, and I said I'll have a bud. This was in Davis, California, and it was about 3 months out of date. And the reason was that when they empty the cabinets, they take the beer out the front, and then they fill it up like that, and there's stuff lurking there. So people say, how do I, I need to buy this new brew house that minimizes oxygen uptake. Well, have you make sure the stock gets rotated first, and have you invested in? I remember giving a talk in Milwaukee once, and they gave me a title, a critical control point analysis of beer flavor stability, and I stood up and I said, keep out the oxygen, keep it cold. Are there any questions? And people were saying, well, what about those of us who've invested in, oxygen miserly brew houses? And I said, unless you've invested in the best packaging line that's going to minimize oxygen uptake, you're wasting your money. Unless you have control over your product as it's distributed in the marketplace, you're wasting your money. It's because, like you say, you stick it on a. I remember coming here years ago out to the 4X Brewery, and there's this, I don't know, like you have in these trucks with lots and lots of
trucks
with like a little train on a road, and he said, look at I don't know what was on the door, Wagga Wagga or something. I don't know. You have such interesting places over here, but he said this truck has come, I don't know how many thousand kilometers this truck had come with, and it wasn't refrigerated. And there's stuff bouncing around on the back of the thing. And that's not good for quality, either visual quality or flavor stability. But I understand the practicalities of it.
The first thing I thought of when you were talking about that was when I first got involved in the beer business. I remember an old 4X sales rep talking about that, and they ship beer 2,000 kilometres into Queensland in 40-degree heat.
Yeah.
And then it gets put in a tin shed out behind the brewery.
Yeah.
They only get 1 delivery a month.
Yeah.
And the sales rep said that they would bring them down once a year, these publicans, take them out to the Brecky Creek and have a fresh beer. Yeah. And the publicans would say, gee, this bloke doesn't clean his lines, this tastes terrible, when it was the freshest beer that they'd ever had.
Yeah. And of course, if they clean that up, probably the customers would go, there's no bloody flavour in this, and that, I guess, is the problem. People have said to me, and let's name names now, they're in California, and they say, I just love Pilsner Urquell. Okay? Well, Pilsner Urquell, of course, from the Czech Republic, by the time it's in Davis, it's thoroughly stale. And this guy said, I love it, and I'm really looking forward to going to the Czech Republic. Well, by the time when that guy got to the Czech Republic, he wouldn't have encountered Pilsner Urquell smelling of like he was used to it. What he would actually encounter would be diacetyl. Well, I don't pronounce that. In the US, I've got to say diacetyl. But diacetyl, or whatever it is, the stuff that stinks of bloody popcorn and butterscotch and so on. Now, that would be a shock to him in two ways, because he wouldn't recognise that in the flavour. That is the smell of a fresh Pilsner, Urquell. But that brings in the whole story, the whole point about what do people want to drink. To me, I hate cardboard, but I hate diacetyl a hell of a lot more. I can't tolerate a beer that smells of butterscotch or popcorn. But in the Czech Republic, they drink more beer than anywhere else in the world, and their number one brand there, Pilsner Urquell, smells of diacetyl, and that's what people are expecting to drink. So who sets the rules about what is right and what is wrong, you know? So if diacetyl is good for some people, it sure as hell is no good for me. But you know, to say that is the wrong flavour, that's expected on a fresh Pilsner Urquell. So I personally prefer a stale one on those circumstances, but I'm sure most people in the Czech Republic don't.
In the world of craft beer, I guess we can differentiate a little bit from the very well-known mainstream lagers that have very good production processes, they pasteurize, and they have at least some rigour around sending the beer around the country. We've seen craft beer, particularly the hop-driven beers, which have been very popular. About 7 years ago, we interviewed Greg Cook on the program, and he said, I do not plan to send my beers to Australia. If you're in Australia, do not drink my beers, because you're not drinking the beer that I intended to make, because you can't drink it in Australia the way I intended to make it. Something's happened over the last 7 years. He's become a little bit more pragmatic. He's sending his beers down here, and there was a furore recently because when he said, I don't want you drinking my beers after 3 months, now he's suddenly putting a 9-month use-by date on so he can send it down here. Do you have any thoughts about the pragmatism that needs to take place in the craft beer world to marry those two ideas?
Well, you've hit upon a name that winds me up anyway, so you're...
One of two, I think, Charlie.
There's one or two, and they both got the same bloody surname. But anyway...
and both got a fair roast in Adelaide.
Yeah.
Along with the Germans and the French. And the South Africans.
No,
it's fair to say he didn't miss. It's an equal opportunity offender, to be fair.
I know. I'll take the piss out myself, but there's certain things I think people need to stand by their principles. And I understand pragmatism, but if somebody really, really believes in something and they're really passionate about it, I think it's very important that they stick to those beliefs. Because, you know, what can you trust if you suddenly change your rules and your principles? You know, I understand if you're gonna say you can't possibly do it, just to actually make a market for it by saying it's okay, I didn't really believe it anyway. To me, it doesn't sit comfortably with me. But again, it's a challenge, and it's a real challenge, and you know, it puts me in mind of the fact that you know, people, you make a decision on a beer. There's so many visual clues about the beer. Beer in a can is more stable than beer in a bottle. And yet, psychologically, for many people, beer in a can is not as classy a product as beer in a bottle. Beer in a can is actually better. Did I tell this story last time I was here about me drinking beer in a can?
They weren't listening.
Yeah.
Say it again.
So my wife Diane and I were in Oklahoma City, and you know, and I was in the restaurant, and this woman said, "What would you like to drink?" I said, "What craft brews do you have?" She said, "I got Bud, Miller, and Coors." I said, "Any others?" She said, "Yeah, I got one more." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Pabst Blue Ribbon." I said, "I'll have one of those." And it came in a can, and I went, "Oh." And Diane said, "What is it with you? You stand up in front of people, you bitch about how beer is better in a can than it is in a bottle. They bring you a can and you moan about it." And I said, because I don't think a can fits in a restaurant. It's a psychological thing, you know. I got a white tablecloth here and I got a nice glass. I don't want a can, I want a bottle. And she said, "Get over it," you know. But it's psychology, and I'll tell this story.
Diane actually gets to sit here while you're saying these things.
Yeah, she's agreeing with it. No, that's true. You know, I was telling you earlier on, and I don't think I've used this before, but there is this well-known brand of beer in the US that I mentioned earlier on with a born-on date on it. And I did a study a while ago, you know, and I took the fresh version and I put it in the oven and cooked it for a month. And then I cooled it down, and we took it into Sacramento, and we took the fresh version, the stale version, and we presented them to people. And we took the fresh version and the stale version and put each of them on a mat that had the brand name on there. And 50% chose the fresh, and 50% of people selected the stale version. And then we did the same thing, and we put them both onto white mats that didn't have any branding on them, and 50% preferred the fresh, and 50% preferred the stale. And then we took the stale version, so it's the same stale beer in 2 glasses. We put one on a Budweiser mat, one on a white mat, and they voted 2-1 for the one on the white mat. But then we took the fresh version and put it in both glasses, put one on a Budweiser mat and one on a white mat, and they voted 2-1 for the Budweiser. So they could see something was happening, but if you gave them a given specific brand, they kind of were confused. The only response I got was from the Anheuser-Busch company, who phoned me up and said, "Charlie, where did you do that?" And I said, because I'm a free, independent spirit that does strange, bizarre things. But so I think it's reinforcing your message about freshness, but it does speak to the fact that, you know, a lot of people are used to some of these stale characters. And a colleague of mine did a study of imported beers into the United States and compared to them branded and non-branded. And if brands were attached to them, they chose these imported beers. They were better. You know, a little bit of England, a little bit of Germany, a little bit of Holland. And so. Somebody said Heineken, a great German beer. So it shows how much they know. But when they were blind, they were totally confused. So people they make decisions. In the United States, it's craft. Got to be better. That's why if a company is bought by one of the big guys, suddenly the beer's crap now, isn't it? It's got to be, you know, because it's made by a big guy. Or imported. Even though it's stale, better, because it's imported. So people make decisions based on a storyline. Yeah.
And you touch on a very interesting point there, which is, you know, at the end of the day, you know, perception is reality. Matt's story about the country cockies, publicans coming down and trying beer as it was intended,
yeah.
But for them that's not what it's like. We often speak in Australia about the bintang effect, which is where, you know, bintang will taste great when you speak about, oh no, it's the stuff they send over here is rubbish. You know, the stuff over there is great. Well, you've paid, you know, $1.20 for it. You're getting a, you know, 20-cent.
Pete, I'm a POM. What the hell is bintang?
Oh, Charlie, we have much to go on our journey. One example that you used, I think you were asked a question in a lecture once by a lady about the distinctive taste of Guinness. Because people often say, you know, again, the Guinness effect, if you like, rather than the bintang effect, that the stuff over there is so much better.
Actually, I was referring to a great American president by the name of Barack Obama, who observed that you know, he detected...
Oh, nice segue, Dark.
Yeah, nice segue. Not intended, but anyway. But he observed that, you know, that the Guinness is fresher in Dublin, and you know, and you'd say, and I used to say, you know, the blander the beer, the bigger the problem, because, you know, you can't hide anything in a bland beer. And Guinness, therefore, is, you know, got more protect, but still the flavour changes perceptually. And when I used to say that the bland beer is the biggest problem, people like Ken Grossman, Vinny Chillerzo and so on, they'd say, Charlie, we've got far bigger worries about our IPAs than we do about, you know, some of the less intensely flavoured beers. Those beers change very, very quickly. And again, it speaks to the point that the chemistry is different. With IPAs, it's scalping of hop oil, sticking onto the cork, the crown cork, and things like that. You know, so you got these things changing in different ways. No two beers age in exactly the same ways, but sure as hell, beers age. And one of the potentials is you say, okay, let's just sell it. Let's celebrate that. A winemaker would celebrate it, but as I think I probably said before, they wouldn't use words like Tomcat P and cardboard, they'd say feline and damp parchment. And suddenly it would be sexy, you know.
But there's a poetry in that.
Yeah.
And that's a way to sell it. Now, we do have a question from Facebook, and Simon Godden asks, do you have a preference for seeing brewed on or best before on a label?
Either way, as long as if it's born on, then you actually got some information about specifically when it was actually made. So you can and as long as it gives some qualification, like it does on the brand I was talking about earlier on, where it says best consumed within 110 days. Mind you, when that company Concern were bought out by another company, some of the brands, they changed it from 110 days to 180 days. Without making any changes whatsoever. But, so, you know, I think if it's a best before date, I think it's got to mean something, you know. I mean, I'm used from my days in the UK to 9-month shelf lives. And I went to the British government once to request some money to do work. Those are far-sighted days when the British government gave money to do research on beer. And there's a guy in Whitehall with a pinstripe suit. Good morning, good morning. I said, oh, good morning. How are you? I said, I'm very well, thank you. What can I do for you? And I said, well, you know, we'd like some money to work on freshness. And he said, what's the problem? I said, beer goes stale. And I see. Do you put a best before date on? I said, yeah, 9 months. He said, why 9 months? I said, because in 9 months we're confident it's not going to go cloudy and change in its appearance, but it will go stale. I said, yeah. So people can buy it after 9 months? Yeah, I said, yeah. And do they? I said, yeah. He said, what's the problem? Which is correct. Now, I took a group of students over to England last July, a year ago. We went to a very famous brewery, and in the warehouse, there's beer sitting there in the warehouse, with a 9-month shelf life. And, you know, this beer was about 5-6 months old before it even left the bloody warehouse. And it wasn't a refrigerated warehouse, you know. And I can tell you the beer would be stale before it even left the brewery yard, you know. And to me, it's, you know, and people stand up and say, oh, it's marvellous, wonderful English ale. And I'm thinking, no, it's not, it's shit. So it's a tough one, and you know, it could very easily lose me a lot of friends, because I got a lot of friends in the industry that probably are not as much into freshness as I am. But you know, I think either way, but whatever it is, it's got to be lived up to. And I think if you've got a best before date, you've got to decide on principle, what do you expect it to be? If that best before date is, if it's after this date, it's going to be stale, then that's going to be a fairly short period of time.
If you were in a bar ordering a beer, and I'm sure that doesn't happen very often,
no.
But if you were ordering a beer and you had a choice of beers, what would be the longest that you, and all of the beers had a born on date, what would be the longest date that you would choose yourself to buy a beer?
Well, I probably, you know, let's be honest about it. You know, I'm not going to scrutinize it, because most of the beer I'm going to be buying and consuming is beer on tap. So I'm not going to see that label anyway. But let me segue then to another story. And this, you see, I don't like to make a fuss. Bless you, Diane. That's my wife sneezing at the back.
I think what she said was bullshit.
But what Diane will tell you is I don't complain in restaurants, and I don't complain in bars usually either. On this one occasion, so you can bring me the wrong meal, and I'll probably eat it and not make a complaint. But I think we were either in Portland or Seattle, I'm not sure which, and we're in a bar, and I went like that. And she said, what are you doing? So this girl came across. What? And I said, you need to know this beer didn't smell like this when it left the brewery. And it was diacetyl, and it was obviously a line that hadn't been cleaned properly, and it had pediococcus growing in it, and it was belting out diacetyl. And she carried on chewing, and she said, all right, we'll choose something else then. And walked away. And Diane said, do you know what I thought you were going to say? I said, what? Do you know who I am? So the last time, recently I was in London, and I went into they only had one cask ale. If I go into a pub in London, I look around. I'm looking for these. That's what I'm looking for. And if I don't see them, I walk out and go to another pub. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, we have poker machines in Australia as well.
Yeah, something like that. And so I got this, and it was kind of not quite bright. And you know, I went back to the table, got opened my newspaper, and doing the crossword and so on. And I went, oh my God, you know. And it, you know, cask ale is like is a dream drink when it's on form. And when it's not on form, it's vinegar. And this was vinegar. And I thought, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Because an old boss of mine once complained in a pub and said, who do you think you are? And he said, I want to see the cellar. Well, bugger off, you know. So I just didn't want to make a fuss, you know. I didn't want to make a fuss. But back to the company I mentioned earlier on, they used to tell me, you know, you go into a bar, you find an out-of-date product, phone us up, and we will withdraw it from trade. So as long as you believe in it, as long as a company believes in what they're stamping on the label, and as long as they will recover a beer from trade, and go for it, and believe in it and celebrate it. If you're not going to celebrate that, you're not going to believe in it, then don't put the bloody date on in the first place.
Charlie, you spoke before about hazy beers and about not upsetting people. What have you got against New England IPAs?
God.
Where to begin?
You know,
That in the biz is what we call a setup.
Do you have the? I mean, over in I'm a good Church of England lad. You know, but in America we call it Episcopalian. But I'm an Episcopalian with Buddhist tendencies, and I look for the middle way, and I like to tolerate and accept different opinions and so on. So I brought that sort of Buddhist tendency into the whole consideration of East Coast IPA. You know, I was brought up to like and to respect and expect bright beer, and it shouldn't be cloudy. There's a lot of beers in the so-called craft sector in the States that are NQB, not quite bright. And over the years, I've come to tolerate them a little bit on the grey side, you know, not sparkling. But East Coast IPAs, and I'm fond of using the words chicken soup, but to me, it looks like, you know, if you get a cylindrical fermenter and you start to drain out the yeast, I'm thinking, if I drink that, my bowels. And so, to me, there's this disconnect between this grotesque turbidity and appeal. But people brew them, and people drink them, and people buy them. And so who am I? What right do I have to say that people shouldn't accept East Coast IPAs? But it does make them bad people. So, no, I don't mean that. So, you know, people often say to me, what's a good beer? I say, I don't know. What do you like? What I like is irrelevant. I don't want, you know, to be, you know, the Robert Parker, you know, pontificating about what is, my 3-year-old grandson loves that, pontificating about what is right and what is wrong. And the same thing applies to staleness and everything else. So if people want East Coast IPAs, it's not my business to say that's wrong.
I've got a question for you, Charlie.
Dr. Bamforth Aug.
Charlie, please.
Charlie, sorry.
Yeah.
Charlie, I've heard you talk on the Brewing Network, which is obviously pretty Brews, but you've talked about this same sort of topic with JP and Warren, who have this same kind of about the cloudy IPAs and everything like that, and it just sort of escapes me some of the quotes that you've actually used with your UC Davis graduates when you talked about this type of thing.
Well, I thought I'd already done that, but no, when I've got the students in, I point out to them that we have whole sessions on clarity, and this next quality book will be about colour and clarity, and most beer historically was expected to be, well, in the last number of years, relatively bright, and people put a lot of effort and passion into stabilizing beer. We used to have a beer in Bass called Worthington White Shield. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that.
Classic.
And of course, at the bottom of the beer, there's this yeast. This big sediment of yeast. And we were taught how to pour out a Worthington White Shield without getting an incredibly turbid product. And you had to have the right glass, and that's magic for beer. And you had a Worthington White Shield written on it, and you always turned it so that the label was facing somebody else, so they could admire your selection. And then you raise the glass, and you raise the bottle, and you pour it like that until just before the yeast leaves, and then you turn the bottle over, drink the yeast out of the bottle, because that keeps you regular, and B vitamins and so on and so forth, and then savor the beer. But, the last thing you wanted to do was that. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that a very good friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, has a brewery in Adelaide, and they have, and they have the same sort of story. And I think I've told this story before, that on that occasion when I came to Brisbane years ago, I ordered a Cooper Sparkling Ale, took it back to my table, didn't realize, didn't think about it, just poured it in like that, and I said, oh my God. And I took it back to the barman. I said, I think there's something wrong with the beer. He said, it's supposed to look like that, you pommy bastard.
But that's a great example there, Charlie, because Cooper's advertised their point of difference, cloudy but fine.
Yeah.
Because it was distinctive from...
That's right. And I don't know, in the Outback Steakhouse in the States, they'll say, do you want it rolled? Do you want it rolled, And it's a storyline. It's a storyline. And that's okay. And so I guess the East Coast IPA is a storyline. But I reckon Rocky Mountain Oyster Stout is a storyline. Just don't include me in the bloody storyline.
Everyone knows what the Rocky Mountain Oyster Stout is. It's made with cow's testicles.
Rocky Mountain oysters.
Rocky Mountain oysters.
Yeah, probably not
Cows don't have testicles.
Oh, no, sorry.
That's why he's a professor.
And since the advent of Rocky Mountain Oyster Stout, many of the bulls don't have testicles either.
It's in high demand.
A little bit like the cow at the abattoir, Matt. You walk straight into that.
Moving on.
I see what he did there.
And he writes all his own material too.
Now, we another question from Facebook. Karina Steep from Prancing Pony Brewery in South Australia has said, good to see you all. Can you ask Charlie what he thinks of the explosion and trends of barrel-aged beers?
Yeah, and I just came back from the sister location, Newstead, and I see all the barrels there lined up and ready to go. It's an interesting. I personally think that's a more, to my, senile sort of viewpoint and a more traditional way of looking at things. I get that much more than I do some of the wacky ingredients. So the barrel aging and some of the interesting flavors that you're going to be extracting on storage. And again, that speaks to the fact that there are beers that you can build a storyline around and you can mature and age and pick up the various nuances from the different types of barrels and so on. So I think it's interesting. I personally, it's not the styles of beer that I particularly want to be savouring. And my wife's coming in for some attention tonight, but anything that's been anywhere... Let me just pull that. Sorry. Oh, well, life in the old dog, yeah. But anyway, what I meant to say was that if she's encountered any drink that has been anywhere near a barrel, so it's a wine or anything like that, terrible migraine types of problems. And so I hope that brewers will realize that there's probably going to be a goodly number of people who will be consuming products that have been aged in wood. That it might not be the sort of thing that they want to be drinking. So, but having said that, fascinating stuff. Sour beers generally in the United States, I mean, huge interest at this point in time. I mean, sour beer for me, yeah, great. Just let's get a small bottle, let's share it out between about 6 of us, and give me some nice stinky cheese. It's a marriage made in heaven. You have some of Vinnie Cilurzo's sour beers with some nice goat's cheese and so on. Beautiful pairing. But give me a bottle of it, and I'll share it with you. If you really want to, I'll buy the beer and you can drink most of it. And but lots of people love them. I could no more finish a pint of a sour beer than, But then again, I can't drink Reusch beers with the smoky flavour from Bamberg. I can't drink large quantities of those. The intense accumulation of flavour to me. But I may have told, I don't know, forgive me if I've told this story before. Vinny has ever...
Are there any stories you haven't told before,
I have
Charlie?
no idea, no.
Diane?
I tell you, recently I was on the TV in Sacramento and my son recorded it. And he was sitting with his girlfriend, and he started showing the program, and he stopped it, and he said, right, my dad is now going to say, and then carried on. At the end, he nearly lost his girlfriend, I think, because she was so pissed with him for being so smart. But yeah, so I was with Vinny once, and I was, and Vinnie Cilurzo, this is Russian River Brewing Company, and in his barrels he's got a nail in the bottom of the barrel. And you want a sample of it, he has a hammer with a claw hammer, and he hooks out the nail, and a stream of the beer goes into it, and he puts the nail back in. Brilliant. And so I'm tasting it. I said, Vinny, is this the beer that was described as being like a wet dog urinating in a telephone book? And he said, yeah. Yeah, that's probably the best one we've ever had. Yeah. And that's fine, But if somebody said to, Mr. Coors, your beer tastes like a wet dog, he probably won't be very happy. But horses for courses. And
it kind of, Charlie, comes back to that, we've often discussed the marriage between art and science and respecting in equal parts both. And I recall one of the sessions from last week in Adelaide at the Craft Brewers Conference, where one brewer quite proudly sort of asked your opinion on a beer that he had made the day before, using quite a bit of pineapple. And I can't remember your answer because for 5 minutes you hung your head going, oh, for fuck's sake.
I said, well, if you're going to put pineapple in beer, make sure it's been cooked. So Diane's in the audience. So anyway, she's really coming in for it. A number of years ago, my wife made a jelly with fresh pineapple in it. And she came up to me and said, the jelly's not setting. I said, no, of course not, it won't. Because there's an enzyme in there called bromelain, and it's chewing up the proteins, and the jelly's not going to set. Stupid. So, well, next time, my dear, use tinned pineapple because it's been heat processed and it kills off the enzyme. So, there are enzymes in pineapples. But I like pineapple juice for lunch. I had salad as well, but I had some pineapple juice with it. And pineapple I can just about tolerate, and there's a history of using fruit in beer and so on. But, I don't know what the answer was.
Do you think there's a...
Probably a different one to that one.
Let me set up a juicy lob for you and you can spike it into the backcourt. Do you think there's we have perhaps moved past that point at which now we need to differentiate ourselves from mainstream beer, and we're beyond? Have we become a bit of a cliche or a caricature of ourselves if we start or continue to use the belly button fluff or the bull semen or whatever it might be? Are we going to move back to?
I hope so.
Subtle,
I hope so,
nuanced.
Yeah. And I told this story in Adelaide, so if anybody's heard it more than once, anyway. And when I first arrived in Davis, which is well known for its viticulture and enology program, I said to the chairman of viticulture and enology, could you help me? And he said, yeah, sure, how can I help you? I said, well, I've been asked to write an article about what the brewer can learn from the winemaker, and I can't think of anything. And of course, that was totally wrong. You can learn about celebrating raw materials, and for some reason, winemakers do an astonishing job out of celebrating diversity just based on grape varieties and locations. And what have we got? We got barley and malt, barley and therefore malt, hops, water, yeast, alone, without reaching to bits of animals and so on. We got so much we can tell stories around. Now at the moment there is this huge interest in celebrating different barley varieties, for example, and I get it. Now I'm not sure it's true. People talk about Maris Otter from England, okay, which is a great barley variety. It's a winter variety as well, so that's one in the eye for those that don't believe in winter barley varieties. It's a winter barley variety, and it's big in the craft sector in the US, preferably floor malted. So you've got somebody's sweat dripping onto it and they tell stories about it, how it's got this unique character. Well, I can't help but feel that the way which it's malted is going to be more important than the variety itself, and the precise steeping and germination and kilning conditions. But the important thing is it's a storyline. And all the different malt types are storylines. And all the different hop varieties are storylines. And the water, okay? And of course, the yeast strains. I mean, last time I went to do it, the biggest winery in the world is in the Central Valley in California. And they showed me all around. And of course, this was, away from the crush, so there was nothing going on. They were painting the bloody walls or something, Everything happens in about a month. But this was out of season, so they were just, and they said, well, this is where we had the yeast. I said, well, what is your yeast? And the guy said, yeah, we changed recently. I'm not quite sure what we're using now. And that was it, And they don't give a rat's ass about the yeast. Whereas in the brewing industry, there's all these different yeast strains. So much to go at, so much to celebrate, without going to crazy extremes and doing bizarre and wacky things.
So Charlie, aside from the obvious resources here in Australia, like say Australian Brews News, Australia's leading resource for brews news and opinion.
Fantastic as well.
But how do we get that story out? How do we get that education across? Because you spoke eloquently at the in your keynote address about the very basic, the wine has the moral high ground, and wine is seen as the healthy alternative, which I'm fair to say you absolutely smacked out of the park. Yeah. But how do we tell that story?
Well, it's a complicated one, particularly when it comes to health. I personally don't think that the people who purvey things should be the people telling the stories about the health. I think that should be coming from right-minded and responsible medics and so on and so forth, talking about it and so on. But it is about education. And I think education is paramount, whether it's education of the brewer or whether it's education of the consumer. I mean, Ina, who replaced me on the podium succeeded me on the podium.
She did well to hang around because you gave her a fair slap.
Yeah.
Metaphorically.
But she put up a slide which indicated that the people's lack of understanding about how beer is made and what beer is made out of and what is beer and so there are people that are doing things now. I'm not sure what's happening in Australia, but in the UK, associated with the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, we have the Beer Academy. There's the Cicerone program in the States and so on, educating people. And then that is educating people who want to sell beer or they want, but you're doing this sort of thing as well, celebrating beer and bringing beer to the masses. Amen. Presenting beer to its best advantage. In the States, the way beer is presented is criminal. I mean, you're lucky to get it on the lid. They'll bring you this fancy wine list, but you're lucky to get the beer list. The way it's presented, the glasses, the wrong bloody glass for the wrong beer. It's a dirty glass. All of that. So I think that whether it's the brewers getting together to find some sort of co-sponsored way to celebrate beer, whatever it is, something has to be done. Because the wine in the States, the wine guys have got it right. I mean, they somehow, through their organizations, have got people's perception of wine to be that it's this sophisticated, complex, hard to make beverage which is healthier, a better food pairing, and so on. And the reality is beer is far better. So it's happening, and I don't absolutely have all the solutions, but it needs people to independently realize, and ideally it's probably not people overtly from the brewing industry, but others, to actually celebrate this beer, which has been 8,000 years in making.
Does beer need to find its own resveratrol?
Those of you who don't know what resveratrol is this magic thing that's supposed to be in red wine that cuts down the risk of your arteries from blocking. But you've got to drink 160 bottles of red wine every day to get enough of that.
But yet people associate antioxidant health value with red wine as being a good
red
source.
wine. But you see, again, if I stand up and say things, people say, "Well, you've got to say that. You've been part of the brewing industry 40 years. You're not going to give us the bad news." And I say, "Yes, I do give you the bad news. I'll tell you the problems, but I'll tell you the benefits as well." So whoever it is, particularly when it comes to health, it's really got to be an independent spirit that does it. It's got to be right-minded people from the medical profession that are prepared to say, drinking beer in moderation is actually good for you. And the nutritional value of beer is far in excess of wine. So beer is actually it's got a lot of nutritional value. And liquid bread is a perfectly reasonable description for what beer really is. And people talk about, well, they say, you get a beer belly. You get a wine belly if you have as many. The main source of calories is alcohol. It's not carbs or anything like that. It's alcohol. That's the main source of. And if you've got a high alcohol beer, you're going to put in per glass. You're going to put in more calories than you will with a lower alcohol product. So people have got to understand that beer is portrayed as being a sort of a second-rate drink. And I was saying to somebody just the other day, people say, well, beer is the one that, if you see any report about bad behaviour, they always show a glass of beer. Well, people know that if you've got a glass of beer with a foam on it, it's beer, it's alcohol. But if you said this is bad news about alcohol, they showed you a glass of vodka, how the hell do you know it's not a glass of water? So they don't show you that. A red wine could just as easily be black currant juice or something. So you show a beer, and therefore beer is the product that's associated with bad behaviour. Some people behave badly when they drink beer, but a lot of people view it as a very wholesome part, an adjunct to a delightful lifestyle.
Charlie, a big thing that we celebrate is the ingredients, and whenever you see videos of celebrating beer, you see sweeping barley fields, or you see floor malted malt, or you see hop fields, all of that. We've seen recently the new generation of hop extracts where they manage to keep the aroma and those sorts of characters. How do you feel about those, firstly? And secondly, how do we tell the story about those while still keeping the romance of brewing?
Well, there's a long history of using hop extracts in Australia, I can tell you. And there's one very famous brand of beer that has been bittered with post-fermentation bittering extracts for very many years now. Hops, if you take a bottle of beer, certainly from some of the larger brewing companies, the most expensive component is the bottle, and sales and marketing and taxation and so on. So when you get to the components, that it's down here somewhat. Now I understand if you're brewing in a bucket or brewing on a fairly small scale, some hops, it's a lot of money. But if you're a very, very, very big brewing company, thank you, then pro rata compared with all the other things you've got to, don't cut corners on hops. Again, it is absolutely no secret the guy in the brewing industry that I admire the most is Ken Grossman, and Ken will only use whole cone hops. He will only use the native hop cone, and because he believes you do anything to a hop, you'll detract from it. Even when you dry a hop, you're taking away something. If Ken had his druthers, I'm quite sure he'd make all his production in, just like in the world of wine, he'd make it all when the hops are nice, newly picked, and make all his beer then. Of course, it's not feasible, so he has to dry the hops. But that's as far as he's going to go. And he won't pelletize them. He won't have pellets. He won't have extracts and so on, because he believes that that whatever you do, it is not as the native thing. Now, there's some excellent hop products out there, and many excellent brewers that use pellets and extracts. And they mentioned another California brewer earlier on that's well known for using pellets, and it's okay, and you can make some great beers that way. It is easier to romance a hop cone, if you like, than it is a liquid extract. I actually find it, and I understand the opportunity it presents to create diversity downstream. I used to work for a guy who believed that you should just have one product stream, a bland product stream, and you create your diversity downstream. Different malt preparations, different malt flavors, malt extracts with no color, colored extracts with no flavor, hop aroma compound, bitterness compounds. So you can create all your diversity downstream. It's a logical chemical engineering approach to making beer. But to tell stories about that and romance that and the traditions of that is probably not quite so straightforward. I have to say, and this is purely subjective experience, that I find beers made with hop extracts less drinkable. Now, I have no scientific basis for that, but there was one famous company in the UK that used to use a lot of hop extracts, and I remember being given some to take onto a train with a group of colleagues. It was about 4 hours north of London we were travelling back from, and we left the beer on the train. We couldn't drink it. So,
but there have been some terrific beers made with the lupulin powders and things that we've seen recently. So, do you think that they will take on, or do they take it?
I have no idea whether they'll take on or not. If they're good, and if they're enjoyed by people, they will take on. It depends whether you want to build a story around it. I will qualify just what I said about Ken. He has a product called Hop Hunter, and what he does with Hop Hunter, he takes the fresh hops and he steam distills off still more aroma and puts that into the product as well. And that's as far as he's going to go. So can you make beers that taste good in ways other than the Reinheitsgebot? Yes, of course you can. Of course you can. If you want to build a story around it, I think it's harder to build a story around supercritical CO2 extracts than it is from whole hop cones.
Matt, we've only got a couple of minutes left before we finish up the Facebook Live portion of the evening before we retire downstairs and get into more beer and a more intimate, informal chat with Charlie. Does anyone have any questions before we go? There we go. Thanks, Matt. I notice he's got a beard, Charlie.
All right, yeah.
In terms with the Cooper's Brewery you were talking about before.
Cooper's?
Yeah, Cooper's, so this South Australian brewery.
Yeah.
Beers that are sterile filtered or pasteurised versus beers that are bottle conditioned, in ideas that you can't remove oxygen or entirely from the beer and not being able to change the temperature, what is your idea about them being stored for the amount of times, and benefits of that?
Well, bottle conditioning is it's a fascinating topic, and of course, again, my friend Ken is probably the guy who makes more bottle conditioned beer than anybody else in the world. Yeah. And it's a two-edged sword. One is, the good news is this, that yeast will do two things. Yeast will scavenge oxygen, and yeast will also take away staling molecules. So if you take a stale beer, take a really stale beer, and you expose it to nice, new, fresh yeast, you can get rid of the stale flavour with the yeast. So yeast is a great friend of brewers. And this is one of the reasons why I personally, I'm always very suspicious about people who worry about brewing oxidation in the brew house, because the yeast is going to clean all that up, The bad news about yeast is that it will, depending on how fresh it is and how aged it is and senile, there will some degree of autolysis, but also it releases an enzyme, a proteolytic enzyme, that damages the foam. Yes, sir.
Just another quick question. The time length between one finishing and the other starting again. So autolysis starting and the amount of time it takes for oxygen deterioration.
Well, I think
say is the longest amount of time that those.
It depends on the quality of the yeast. And so the bottom line is, if you're going to be doing bottle conditioning, you've really got to be mindful of the quality of that yeast, and how fresh it is. And that applies generally in brewing, I think, in primary fermentation as well. One thing we discovered in Bass, not with bottle conditioned beers, but with the biggest selling brand of beer in the UK, is that if we allowed the yeast to go too many generations from fermentation to fermentation, it didn't do the foam any good. So I was giving this story actually in the southwest of England, where my wife's from Cornwall, but down in St Austell. And I said, and somebody said, well, how many generations do you recommend? And I said, less than 10. And this guy said, and this is from a traditional English brewery, he said, well, the last time I checked, we were 4,627. I said, well, carry on.
And then there are breweries that only use
and then
fresh
another
every
good friend,
time.
name drop, another good friend of mine, Dan Gordon of Gordon Beers, he never goes from one fermentation to another. He will only ever use newly propagated yeast every time.
Well, folks, at that point, that's where we need to finish up our Facebook Live side of things. So to all our friends out there in Facebook land, we'll bid you a fond farewell.
And just before
we're going to keep going. Things are going to get a little blue after 6 o'clock, so we're going to cut you off now and keep going with Charlie.
And just before we do, we need to thank our good friends at Bintani for sponsoring tonight, for presenting tonight. Newstead Brewing, big round of applause for Newstead Brewing.
Well done to both. Thank you very much.
Our Facebook Live audience haven't seen the jugs that have been floating around for the last hour, which is another good reason to finish. And we also need to thank the Independent Brewers Association that has also helped us to present tonight. So thank you very much to our presenters, and hopefully our audience at home have really enjoyed the chat with Charlie, and they've had some great insight and discussion about beer. And thank you very much for joining us, and we might cut there and get on with the adults only portion.
That's it. Thank you, Charlie.